Hello, and welcome back to another bedtime story. Tonight we're going to be reading chapter 21 from Mr. Tweedy. Up to this point, every time we had sung, Mr. Tweedy had merely chirped away. But this day was different. For the first time, our singing robin really took his part in our quartet. Each time that we harmonized, he burst forth in rapture. He was like a child trying to cope with an adult chorus. At every pause, he injected a few crystal notes. The effect was unbelievably beautiful. Crossing into Oklahoma to the tune of their state song was something else. The little clown took an aversion to our holding the note O. Each time we started, he scolded at the top of his lungs. He simply wouldn't tolerate that long drawn-out note, so each time we ended up laughing and choking. What fun we had had with that adorable little bird. Finally, we got through the song by Dave counting to 6 and then starting on the second note. That night, I decided to drive a bit later than usual, and as this was the first time I had used my headlights since the shooting episode, it was just before Tulsa at a gas station that I learned that the boys had shot out one of my lights. At any other time, this newfound knowledge would have angered me. However, with so much to be thankful for, somehow I couldn't even think angry thoughts. No doubt the poor kids had been envious, thinking we were on a happy and glorious pleasure trip. Perhaps if they'd known. Suddenly I was ashamed. Granted, I was still in pain. But how much happier, more glorious could any trip be? And all because of a little robin. By the time we were passing through Tulsa, both of the children had fallen asleep. Only Mr. Tweedy was wide awake, keeping me company, chirping to me from my shoulder where he had suddenly decided to perch. This was a strange new way for him to travel, but even stranger was the way I felt. Hitherto, I had always been afraid of night driving, and naturally being afraid, any oncoming headlights disturbed my vision. With the robin perched on my shoulder, I was happy and completely at ease. Without tension, my eyes didn't become riveted to the oncoming beams of light, and I found I could shift my gaze to the road and see quite clearly. It was a wonderful feeling to be able to drive into the night, completely relaxed in the cool, refreshing air. But then it was almost too wonderful. Quite suddenly, I realized I had become unbearably tired and was going to sleep behind the wheel. Of course, if we had been on a lovely divided highway with a parking lane for immediate use, this would have been great, but the road we were traveling on was only a paved country road with just enough room for one car to pass one another. Knowing I couldn't stop at my lane and realizing that it would become disastrous to continue, the sudden appearance of a huge widened area beside the road seemed nothing short of a miracle. As it came to a halt and switched off my headlights, for a moment I was surrounded by blackness. But then I leaned my head back and saw the beautiful heavens filled with stars. With the robin still perched on my shoulder, I fell into a deep, blissful sleep. At daybreak, when I was awakened by a robin whispering his little melody beside my ear, I could barely believe we had spent all night in the car. Looking back, I remembered thinking, I must hurry and get the children into the trailer, but then I must have fallen asleep immediately. Whether Mr. Tweedy had slept or kept an all-night vigil, I don't know, but no sooner had he awakened me than he flew his perch and slept soundly for an hour, at which time the children awoke and we all went into the trailer to have some breakfast. This day on the road was another scorcher. Weather-wise, the previous day had been miserably hot, but with so much fun in singing we had endured the heat without too much difficulty. Only Mr. Tweedy had had a bit of trouble during the peak of the day. With the sun beating down unmercifully and no shade on the highway, we had stopped for a rest under an overpass. The children had gotten out of the car and sat down a few feet away from the open doors. They had tried to get Mr. Tweedy to come out too, but he had refused to budge from his perch. He was panting a bit, breathing with his beak half open, so I told the children to let him be. After we'd driven on a bit further, he seemed perfectly all right again, so I stopped my worrying and thought no more about it until this day when the same thing happened. It was almost noontime when, once again, Mr. Tweedy became listless, and his breathing became worse than the day before. He began panting as though each breath would be his last. After all this time we had loved our little bird, it was frightening to see his little chest heaving so dreadfully. All I could think of was that he was going to die because the trip was proving too much to him, and if he died, whatever would become of my children, of me? After traveling hundreds of miles with our dear little bird, even traveling 1 mile without him was more than I wanted to think about. In desperation, I decided there was nothing for it but to call a halt. Somewhere we could surely find a park or a shady place and stop traveling until Mr. Tweedy felt better again. At a trailer park office, I learned that the nearest cool place was a state park called Red Rock Canyon, and in no time I was headed down the steepest, most snake-curled road I'd ever seen. By the time I finally reached the canyon floor, Mr. Tweedy wasn't the only one who felt sick. How would I ever get us out of here? But then the park superintendent told me that AAA members with trailers were being hauled out by a wrecker every day. Being a member of this automobile club, I felt much better. That afternoon, Mr. Tweedy was so much like his old self that it was hard to believe that only hours earlier I had feared for his life. Compared with the weather above, in the canyon it was only reasonably hot, and he responded quickly to the lesser temperature. In no time he was flying around, playing games with the children, once again bewildering an audience with his antics. When the children and I had went to the swimming pool, he took off on a private sightseeing tour. When we returned 1 hour later, he was taking a snooze on the steering wheel. That evening, after going without food since breakfast, once again our Robin ate with gusto. First, he helped Kathy eat cold chicken and sliced tomatoes. Then he stole baked beans and bits of hot dog from David's plate. Nothing in all this world could have given me more happiness at the sight of that little Robin acting the mischievous clown again. By 8 p.m., I had taken another dip with the children, while Mr. Tweedy amused himself chasing flies around the base of a trash can. While I hobbled back alone for the first time in days, he didn't seem to mind the children's absence. He flew up to his gaslight perch, and before I got started on my travelogue, he was already fast asleep. Much later, when the children returned, he greeted me with a chirp and almost immediately closed his eyes again. That night in the canyon, it was cool and wonderful. Even so, I got up several times during the night to check on our little Robin. In my mind, I kept seeing those dull, half-shut eyes and that was dreadfully heaving little chest, and each time I had to get up to look to make sure he was still all right. This didn't give me the rest I needed, and combined with the apprehension about Mr. Tweedy's state of health, my hips started acting up again. By 7:30 a.m., when the wrecker hauled us out of there, with the greatest of ease, I could barely walk. So I filled up on aspirin and hoped for the best. Weather-wise, in the canyon it had been lovely, but reaching the top, once again the heat was like a furnace. How long would our adorable little Robin last? Again I was worried sick about Mr. Tweedy. I would try driving for a little while, but the moment his breathing became labored or he showed any signs of ill effect from the heat, I would call it a halt, no matter how little mileage accomplished. As it turned out, it was I, rather than a Robin, who needed the first break. Thus, after he had regained his vitality, splashing around in the flower bowl, clowning with the children, chirping and scolding as normal as ever, the heat didn't seem to be troubling him in the least. But the same couldn't be said about my hip. The day that had turned terribly humid, and once again I was in agony. To top things off, the medicine I had taken had given me an upset stomach. Parked in the shade by the Elk City, Oklahoma public swimming pool, I would take a rest while the children had a swim. This idea was fine, but no sooner had Dave gotten out of the car when a host of youngsters from the baseball park spied the bird and came rushing over. Then the show began. When I asked Dave to get me a glass of milk from the trailer, they just couldn't believe that a bird would follow him. When Kathy called Mr. Tweedy, they stared wide-eyed when he flew to her arm. Then when Dave showed them how much he loved flies and would come to the sound of a swat, the whole group went in search of flies or anything which might tempt a robin. In the midst of the happiness, one boy found a large dead locust, which he held up to Mr. Tweedy. I'm sure that he knew it was dried up and not edible, so he must have wanted to see if it would frighten the bird. Instead of Tweedy, it turned out to be the boy who got scared. Our Robin made such a swift lunge for the locust that the boy jumped back a yard and shrieked, "Yikes!" Mr. Tweedy, on the other hand, just clamped down a bit on the dead thing, then gave a swift jerk of the head and flung it from him. Fascinated, as usual, by a Robin, amazed that he could even adapt himself to a group of excited, shouting boys, time passed unnoticed. An hour later, they still hadn't gone swimming. But I had rested and felt much better. While the games continued, I fixed our lunch. An hour after eating, finally the children went for their swim. Mr. Tweedy, seemingly satisfied to watch from the window, remained with me in the trailer. He had exercised a lot, and then barely touched his lunch. Anxious again about his welfare, I was glad he had chosen to take a rest. By 3 p.m., when the children finally came out of the pool, the sun had just passed beyond the protective trees, now beating down unmercifully on our little home. In minutes it was like an oven, and just as fast Mr. Tweedy's chest began heaving again. We would have to move on, but only to the next town, where the youngsters had informed me that there was a lovely public park with a swimming pool and lots of trees. As quickly as possible I would get my little helper out of the sizzling heat. By now, however, my concern was more than just for the moment. If he couldn't tolerate the heat in Oklahoma, how would he survive in Phoenix, which was even further south? I was in a quandary, but there was nothing for it but to wait and see. And that's the end of chapter 21. Tune in on Monday for chapter 22. Let's end with a bedtime prayer. Holy God, thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you have given to us, all that you have provided to us. And Lord, I pray that we get a good night's rest tonight, and that we wake up feeling refreshed and revived and ready to take on the day. Lord, may you show us your love and mercy in fresh and new ways, each and every day, each and every moment. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Good night.